Welcome. I'm so thrilled to have you joining us for today's deep dive. We've got a fascinating and honestly a pretty intense stack of source material to get through today.
Yeah, intense is definitely the right word for it.
Right. We are looking at a recent, highly provocative video commentary and interview from Tucker Carlson, and he's featuring an independent analyst named Brandon Weichert.
And the mission of this deep dive for you listening is to break down their specific interpretation of the current, really escalating conflict involving Israel, Iran, and the United States.
Exactly. We want to separate out the documented geopolitical realities, things we can actually measure, like military supply chains and munitions stockpiles.
Right, the hard math.
Yes,
Yeah.
hard math. Separate that from the highly speculative narratives that the source material presents, like this idea that secret religious wars are actually driving foreign policy.
And before we really get into the weeds here, I want to calmly establish the tone for our discussion today.
Please do.
We are dealing with heavily charged political and religious viewpoints in this material. So I want to remind you, our listener, that we are exploring these topics strictly as an analytical exercise.
We're looking at the media narrative.
Exactly. We're doing this to understand how media narratives are constructed and how different commentators frame global events. We are not endorsing these claims, nor are we taking any sides, politically or religiously. We're simply unpacking the ideas contained in the original source material.
Okay, let's unpack this, starting with the geopolitical stage. The foundational argument Carlson makes here is all about a massive paradigm shift. He talks a lot about the transition from a unipolar world to a multipolar world.
Which is a huge concept.
It is. For those of us who might just think of global politics in terms of, just allies and enemies, how does this unipolar versus multipolar framework actually change the way we view the conflict?
It changes everything about the mental model of how the world operates. Think back to 1945. And especially 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed.
Right, the end of the Cold War.
From that point on, the United States has essentially operated in a unipolar world, meaning there was one pole, one center of gravity.
The U.S. was running the show.
The undisputed heavyweight champion.
Yeah.
It largely got to set the rules of international trade, security, diplomacy. If you grew up in the 90s or the 2000s, your entire baseline understanding of global politics is rooted in America, basically holding all the cards.
Yeah, that's just the water we swim in.
But their core premise, Carlson and Weichert's premise, is that this era is definitively over.
Because of the rise of China, right. The commentary frames China not just as a rival, but as a true peer competitor. And they aren't just talking about population size anymore.
Precisely. The analysis points out that China now matches, and in some sectors even exceeds, the U.S. in industrial output, technological capability, and the sheer size of its real manufacturing economy.
Which changes the whole game.
When you have two relatively matched powers on the global stage, the dynamic fundamentally shifts. You enter a multipolar reality. And in that reality, direct warfare between those massive powers is something they want to avoid at absolutely all costs.
Which brings up a really crucial theory from the material regarding proxy war dynamics. The idea is that nuclear powers absolutely will not risk direct conflict with one another because of mutual destruction.
Right. Nobody wants a nuclear exchange.
So how do they settle the score? They fight in proxy battlegrounds.
Historically, we saw this during the Cold War in places like Vietnam or Afghanistan. The source argues that today, that proxy battleground is Iran.
Interesting.
Iran is positioned here as a crucial node in an emerging alliance that includes Russia and China. So the argument follows that even if China isn't explicitly dropping bombs alongside Iranian forces, Beijing is heavily invested in Iran not collapsing.
Because Iran's survival challenges American dominance in the region.
Exactly. It keeps the U.S. tied up and challenges that unipolar hold.
If we look at how U.S. policymakers are reacting to this, Carlson paints a pretty damning picture. He suggests Washington is completely out of touch with this new reality.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, Carlson is describing a Washington policy establishment suffering from profound hubris. He uses a really relatable analogy, actually.
Yeah, the parent analogy.
Right. Imagine a parent who is used to barking orders at their child for 18 years, and then one day suddenly realizes the kid has grown a foot taller and hits the gym every day.
You can't just bark orders anymore.
You have to negotiate.
Yeah.
You have to use diplomacy. But according to this worldview, U.S. policymakers are refusing to accept that they must now operate and negotiate in a multipolar reality. They're still acting like it's 1995 and they run everything unopposed.
And that stubbornness leads directly into the documented realities on the ground, which might be the most alarming part of this whole discussion. Let's talk about the military and industrial capacity debate.
The math gets pretty dark here.
It does. Brandon Weichert brings up some incredibly stark claims regarding U.S. military logistics, specifically focusing on the Tomahawk cruise missile. According to the numbers he presents, the U.S. has an overall arsenal of about 4,000 Tomahawks.
That's the stockpile.
Right. But then he claims that in just the first 4 days of this conflict with Iran, the military burned through 400 of them.
It is a staggering burn rate, 100 missiles a day. And the math gets much darker when you contrast that burn rate with the replacement rate.
Yeah, tell us about that.
Weichert highlights what he calls a broken defense industrial base. He points out that the U.S. military budget request for 2026 only asked for 59 new Tomahawk missiles.
Wait, 400 used in under a week, and they're only planning to build 59 in an entire year? That math doesn't sound sustainable at all.
It isn't, and that's exactly Weichert's point. He calls this a dangerous race to depletion.
Race to depletion.
In modern warfare, your strategic power is only as good as your industrial base's ability to manufacture the ammunition you are shooting. If you run out of your best weapons, you lose your strategic advantage overnight.
And that depletion has terrifying real-world tactical consequences. Weichert claims that because the military is running out of these advanced missiles, the U.S. and Israel are being forced into a massive tactical shift.
A downgrade, really.
Yeah, they're allegedly shifting to dropping what are known as gravity bombs, specifically JDAMs. What does that actually mean on the ground for the people fighting this war?
Let's translate that for a second to really understand the stakes. A Tomahawk is what is known as a standoff weapon. That means you can fire it from a Navy destroyer sitting in the ocean 1,000 miles away, completely safe from enemy fire.
Because the missile navigates itself to the target.
Exactly. A JDAM, on the other hand, is essentially a guided gravity bomb. To drop it, a human pilot has to fly a multi-million-dollar jet directly over, or at least very close to, the target.
That means flying into hostile airspace.
And actively dodging advanced anti-aircraft fire. It is a massive downgrade in safety. It exponentially increases the risk to the pilots' lives. Weichert argues this shift isn't some clever strategic choice.
It's forced.
It is a desperate measure, dictated entirely by the fact that the safe standoff weapons are running dry.
To make matters worse, they claim the airspace those pilots are flying into is getting more dangerous by the minute, thanks to outside help. Weichert suggests China is actively using Iran as a testing ground for advanced weaponry.
Yes, the intelligence he cites suggests a cluster of Chinese technical officers are on the ground in Iran right now.
And according to the source, they aren't just there to observe.
No, they are allegedly perfecting Iran's growing hypersonic weapons capability. Furthermore, they are supposedly providing real-time satellite targeting to Iranian forces using Chinese surveillance constellations in space.
So they are essentially using the Iranian conflict as a live-fire proxy test against U.S. carriers and bases just to see how their tech holds up against American defenses.
That is the claim, yes.
That is a massive geopolitical claim. But here's where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
Because if the math is that bad and the tactical deficit is that severe, you would think the logical strategic move would be to de-escalate. But Carlson's commentary takes a wild pivot here.
It really does.
He suggests the refusal to back down isn't about conventional military strategy at all. He speculates that this conflict is secretly a global religious war.
This is a major and highly controversial pivot in the source material. Carlson's core speculative claim is that there is an ideological faction driving this war with a very specific ancient goal.
And that goal is?
The destruction of the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem.
Why?
In order to clear the site known as the Foundation Stone on Mount Moriah so they can rebuild the Jewish Third Temple.
Carlson talks a lot about the Third Temple. For those of us who need a quick history refresher, what exactly is the significance of this location?
It's the absolute center of the Abrahamic religions. The first temple was built there by King Solomon in ancient times. The second temple, which is the one standing during the life of Jesus, was famously destroyed by the Romans under Titus in 70 AD.
Right, the Romans tore it down.
Stone by stone, to crush a Jewish rebellion. Since then, for nearly 2,000 years, that site has been an open historical and theological wound. Today, it houses the Dome of the Rock, one of the holiest sites in Islam.
The source mentions that there was actually a historical attempt to rebuild the temple after the Romans destroyed it. When did that happen?
In 363 AD, the Roman Emperor Julian the Apostate attempted to rebuild it. What's fascinating here is his motivation. Julian hated Christianity. Rome had recently Christianized, and Julian wanted to return the empire to paganism.
So how does rebuilding a Jewish temple help with that?
He figured that if he rebuilt the Jewish temple, it would invalidate Christian prophecies that said the temple would fall and never rise again. So he funded the reconstruction.
But it didn't work.
No. According to historical accounts from that era, the attempt was halted by a series of devastating earthquakes and literal dolls of fire erupting from the foundations, which burned the workmen and forced them to abandon the project in terror.
Wow.
And just a few months later, Julian was killed while invading Persia, which is modern-day Iran.
You cannot script history like that. Earthquakes, fireballs, and then dying in Iran. But Carlson argues this isn't just an ancient history lesson. He claims this specific religious goal is actively motivating powerful people today.
Yes.
What kind of modern evidence does he actually point to for this?
He points to a mix of military symbolism and political rhetoric. First, he shows footage of IDF soldiers in uniform wearing unauthorized patches that depict the Third Temple.
Okay.
He also points to the influence of the Hasidic group Chabad. Now, Chabad is a prominent Orthodox Jewish movement, and Carlson claims they have been subtly pushing for the reconstruction of the temple as part of a messianic vision.
And he doesn't just focus on Jewish groups either. He heavily criticizes elements of American Christian Zionism. To give some context for you listening, Christian Zionism is a belief among some Christians that the return of the Jews to the Holy Land and the establishment of the State of Israel is in accordance with biblical prophecy.
Exactly. And Carlson plays a clip of a prominent American pastor, Greg Locke.
Yes, and the clip is quite aggressive. Locke is shown advocating for making the Gaza Strip a parking lot and explicitly calling for blowing up the Dome of the Rock.
In his theological view, rebuilding the Third Temple is a necessary prerequisite to usher in the end times and the return of Jesus. Carlson uses this clip to argue that these aren't just fringe zealot views isolated to small churches. He believes they are alarmingly common and hold real sway over American voters and politicians.
Which brings us to the political figures Carlson calls out. He brings up the president of Argentina, Javier Milei, visiting the Western Wall and speaking joyfully about prophecies of the temple's reconstruction.
And even more directly tied to the U.S. military, he plays a video from 2018 of Pete Hegseth, who the source notes is currently serving as the U.S. Secretary of War.
What does Hegseth say in the video?
In the video, Hegseth is visiting Jerusalem and musing about the miracle of the reestablishment of the temple on the Temple Mount.
Yeah.
He says he doesn't know how it will happen, but he knows it could happen.
This raises an important question, and this is where we really need to carefully parse Carlson's analysis.
Yes, we do.
He is deliberately highlighting the danger of what happens when religious interpretations and symbolic end times narratives blur with mainstream political and military strategy.
His assertion is that this isn't just harmless rhetoric.
Yeah.
He genuinely believes this religious zealotry is secretly driving U.S. foreign policy from the inside.
That's a huge claim.
It is. He argues that the secular West is completely blind to this reality because Westerners are trained to think in terms of economics and secular logic, while much of the rest of the world still thinks and fights in deeply religious terms.
So we have a military running out of its most reliable weapons, facing a severe tactical deficit against a rising multipolar alliance, and Carlson suggests the refusal to back down is fueled by a hidden apocalyptic ideology.
It's a very potent mix.
If you combine all of those elements, you get some truly terrifying escalation scenarios. Brandon Weichert lays out what happens if the U.S. doesn't take what he calls a golden off-ramp immediately. Economically, the stakes are massive. He warns about the Strait of Hormuz.
The Strait of Hormuz is one of the most critical shipping choke points in the world for global energy. Weichert warns that if the conflict escalates and that strait is closed, or if regional oil refineries are destroyed, we could see oil prices spike to $200 a barrel overnight.
What does $200 a barrel actually do to the average person's life?
It breaks the global economy. At $200 a barrel, the cost of transporting every single good food, medicine, consumer products, it just skyrockets.
Everything gets more expensive.
Manufacturing costs double. Supply chains freeze because shipping becomes too expensive. Weichert argues that a shock like that isn't just a mild recession. It triggers a massive cascading global economic depression. People lose their jobs, inflation goes out of control, and basic goods become totally unaffordable.
And militarily, Weichert claims the damage is already happening, and it is catastrophic. He alleges that U.S. bases in the region, specifically the Fifth Fleet headquarters in Bahrain, have been completely devastated by Iranian strikes.
He describes satellite imagery of the base as looking like a moonscape,
Moonscape.
which implies total destruction. Cratered runways, destroyed command centers, a complete loss of operational capability. It paints a very grim picture of American defensive capabilities in the region, suggesting that the U.S. military is far more vulnerable than the Pentagon is admitting publicly.
And that leads to the darkest question of all in this deep dive, the nuclear question.
Yeah, this is the worst-case scenario.
If the Fifth Fleet is a moonscape and the Tomahawks and JDAMs are running out, what happens next? Weichert expresses a deep fear that if the U.S. is staring down the barrel of a humiliating strategic defeat, leadership might resort to what they euphemistically call higher-end weapons.
Specifically, he is terrified they might use low-yield nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
It is a scenario born entirely out of desperation and poor logistical planning.
Because they don't have the conventional tools left.
Right. If you cannot win conventionally because your industrial base failed you, the temptation to use a tactical nuclear weapon to force an end to the conflict grows exponentially.
This ties directly into how media and political commentary frame these conflicts to the public. So think about the assassination of the Iranian Ayatollah that kicked off this specific wave of escalation. Mainstream politicians might frame that event as a bold diplomatic victory or a necessary, precise strike against a sponsor of terrorism.
But Weichert and Carlson frame it completely differently.
Yes.
The analysis suggests it was a disastrous provocation. According to Weichert's intelligence sources, the U.S. and Israel allegedly lulled the Iranian leader into a false sense of security. They supposedly offered fake diplomatic talks during a Holy Week.
And then struck when he was vulnerable.
When the Iranians let their guard down, expecting to negotiate, the strike happened. Weichert argues that this specific tactic has permanently damaged U.S. credibility on the world stage. He says it ensures that adversaries like China and Russia will never trust American diplomatic overtures or peace talks again because they will always assume it's a trap.
It really highlights the massive gulf between how a conflict is sold to the public on the evening news and how independent analysts view the strategic and often very cynical reality on the ground.
It's two entirely different narratives.
So what does this all mean? How do we wrap our heads around an analysis that jumps from cruise missile supply chains to Roman emperors and from unipolar geopolitics to biblical prophecies?
It's a lot to process.
The real takeaway for you here isn't just about missile counts. It's about a paradigm shift.
To synthesize what we've covered, we have to distinctly separate the confirmed geopolitical realities from the highly speculative claims.
Let's start with the reality side.
On the reality side, the U.S. is undeniably facing severe issues with its defense industrial base. The math on munitions production versus wartime depletion is a documented, deeply concerning reality for military planners. Furthermore, the transition away from a unipolar American order toward a multipolar challenge involving China and Russia, that is a widely recognized geopolitical shift that forces a change in how diplomacy is conducted.
But on the other side of the ledger, we have the speculative narrative. The assertion that U.S. military policy is being deliberately engineered behind the scenes by religious zealots to spark a biblical apocalypse, destroy Islamic holy sites, and rebuild the Third Temple remains highly speculative commentary. It is crucial for you, listening to this, to recognize how overwhelming it can be to consume media that blends supply chain logistics directly with end times prophecies. It requires a lot of active critical thinking to separate the logistical math of missile counts from the ideological rhetoric of a religious war.
The logistics are math. The motivations are deeply human, complex, and often hidden behind political spin. Which leaves us with a final thought to mull over.
I'd love to hear it.
We've spent this whole time talking about physical weapons, missiles, gravity bombs, and ancient ideologies, but consider the role of the algorithm in all of this.
The algorithm?
Yes. In a multipolar world where information moves at the speed of light, how much of this religious zealotry is being amplified or even manufactured by social media algorithms designed to reward the most extreme apocalyptic content?
Oh, that's interesting.
If foreign adversaries or even domestic political factions know that end times prophecies drive engagement and stoke division, is the real proxy war happening right on our smartphones, programming us to accept the unthinkable?
That is a chilling thought and an essential one to ask as we navigate this rapidly changing world. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning, keep learning, and we will catch you next time.